If you look at your program, you'll see that the topic for the roundtable discussion is the value of our time in our Christian walk, the value of our time in our Christian walk, with the theme text, Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 1, which reads, "To everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven." When I got the assignment, I thought about how I would, try to address this topic, and through some discussion with some of our family members, it became clear that, at least to me, that I did not want to go down the route of looking at time in a linear fashion, in a way that we often look at it as we look at time, as what can I do, on a minute-by-minute basis, or an hour basis, or on a daily basis, all the things that we normally talk about as brethren, about redeeming the time, the usual things that we talk, which are good, but I think that we do cover that subject quite a bit. And so I thought that it would be perhaps profitable to look at it more as seasons in our life. For everything there is a season. So I've asked the brethren on the panel to address the topic in that fashion. I didn't ask any questions. I didn't give much direction other than to ask, think about some seasons that you've had in your life, and talk about those in ways that might be helpful to some of the brethren who might be going through a similar season, who might have already gone through a season, who might be going through that maybe a little bit later. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out by each of us is going to take a few minutes to kind of go over this poem that's in Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 through 8, and take a few minutes to talk about the poem and perhaps how it relates to the book of Ecclesiastes overall. And then after that, it's just basically going to be kind of a free-for-all. I have no idea where this is going, and Lord willing, it will be profitable. So I think what I'd like to do, because I'd like to hear Brother Tom's voice to make sure that he's with us, I'm going to ask Brother Tom to go ahead and read for us Ecclesiastes 3 and verses 1 through 8. And then, Brother Tom, if you'd like to start out, then you can take whatever time that you need to discuss the poem and maybe how it fits in with the book of Ecclesiastes.
Okay, thank you, Brother Jerry. I trust you can all hear me. And reflecting on our first lesson this morning, I appreciate the brethren's forbearance in allowing me to participate in this way. So the scripture of the first 8 verses of Ecclesiastes 3, I'm reading from the New International Version. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Throughout this book, Solomon contrasts the extremes of human endeavors and actions, and he's basically saying that there is a full spectrum of human behavior that we can observe. But wherever a person may be on that spectrum, no matter what he or she manages to accomplish, it all seems meaningless because it will not endure. In the third verse of the second chapter, he says, I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. And he says that whatever a person accomplishes, it will be left behind at the end of one's life. And who knows whether it will be valued or squandered by those who follow after. And so in verse 20 of that chapter, he says, so my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. As I reflected on that, I think being in a city with a large university, and they're always putting up new buildings on campus, funded by alumni who accumulated a lot of wealth. And guess whose name goes on those new buildings? I think this is one of the attempts of those with that kind of wealth to try and have the things that they've accomplished endure in some way. Solomon also several times makes the point that, there's nothing new. There's nothing new. In Ecclesiastes 1:9, he said, what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. And so he comes to this litany in chapter 3 that we just read, which describes the extremes of human behavior. In each line describes the end of a spectrum of some kind of human behavior. Now, Solomon has also recorded some very important truths in his writing. There are the facts of earth science in chapter 1, relating to weather, the water cycle, for example. He also writes about the life force that animates humans and the condition when that life force departs from us. And so we have the passages we're familiar with in Ecclesiastes, the 3rd chapter, where he says, man's fate is like that of the animals. This is in verse 19. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Man has no advantage over the animal. Everything is meaningless. And then in the 9th chapter, let's look at verse 5. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no further reward, and even the memory of them is forgotten. And then in verse 10, whatever your hands find to do, do it with all your might, for in the grave where you're going, there is neither working nor planning nor knowledge nor wisdom. These are inconvenient truths for most people who embrace what the Bible teaches. Most believe that the Bible teaches that we have an immortal soul that cannot die. So people with whom I have talked and brought up these passages are quick to dismiss this book by saying Solomon was writing from a human standpoint. What he wrote was not inspired. He is merely expressing human wisdom, not the wisdom of God. And that's their attempt to dismiss these things. But in fact, it is great wisdom that Solomon has shared with us. Over.
Thank you, Brother Tom. Rick, would you like to go next?
Yeah, just okay, how's that? How about that? I really appreciate Brother Tom's perspective on this whole thing. And, sometimes when you read Solomon, you think, man, the guy's just confused. He's just depressed and confused. And sometimes when you read Solomon, you think, wow, he's very wise. And both are true. And that's why Ecclesiastes and Proverbs are such very, very, very powerful books, because he does give his human experience, and through the wisdom of his mind, he gives you a sense of I have experienced things, I have seen things, I've understood things, and all seems to be vanity. Why would he say that? Because he understands that humanity is in a very small little box. But he has the wisdom, as Brother Tom said in those many, many passages, to be able to put it into a larger perspective. So when we're reading the parts where Solomon, it sounds like it's well, it's not worth anything anyway. You're reading a portion. Don't take that as the whole context. Take that as a piece of a much larger message that says, yes, from a human perspective, it doesn't look this way, but God has got his hands on all of it. And that's really what this third chapter of Ecclesiastes brings us to. It brings us to the stark realization that our lives are short, they're limited, and you can stop there, or you can say, but what can we do with them? And that's what Solomon is really good at, giving you that sense of, it's really not so great, but look at the much larger picture. So when we look at this in relation to time, and I'll cut it short here, Brother Jerry, in relation to time, I think when we look at Ecclesiastes 3:1-8, this poem, it is very poetic. It is very observant of the fact that lots of different kinds of things happen in a human life. And there is an appropriate time and an inappropriate time for many of those things. And we need to pay attention to where we are, and are we approaching whatever our circumstances in the appropriate manner. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you, Brother Rick. Brother Tom mentioned that there are inconvenient truths in the book of Ecclesiastes. Rick mentioned that, you kind of scratch your head and say, what is this guy talking about? He just seems like so depressed. It's like, why doesn't he just go kill himself? We have to keep in mind that he's not a Christian. He is writing from a perspective of a non-Christian. Now, he is a Hebrew. He is an Israelite. He's under the law covenant, but it's not the same. So we don't want to necessarily put Christian values and thoughts in everything he says. We don't have to do that. And perhaps oftentimes it's a mistake to do that, because then we can't look at him for what he actually is and for what he's saying. The book of Ecclesiastes, like the book of Proverbs, like Job, it's part of what's considered in the Bible wisdom literature. Now, some of the wisdom literature, Proverbs, for instance, it seems to go down a certain way, saying there's a cause and effect. If you live right, you'll be blessed. If you don't live right, you won't be blessed. But it's not that simple, even in Proverbs, because it never guarantees it. Never. And Ecclesiastes and I think Job, they kind of bit of a more of a jaundiced look at wisdom. So Kohelet, the writer here, Solomon, he seems to be a call it like you see it guy. He has got little patience for considering anything that he can't see. And so his scope of understanding in the book is everything that takes place under the sun, which is everything that takes place in life. And so what he sees, for the most part, in the book, as far as I can tell when I read it, is that life is a no-win situation because no matter what you do, you're going to die, and then everybody's going to forget about you. And there is absolutely nothing that you can do to change that. And he goes further, and he says, this is the way that God planned it. Basically, he's pointing the finger at God and saying it's his fault. And he's very frustrated about it. He's very frustrated about it. But, and here's kind of the saving grace, I think, in the book. He says, despite whatever struggles that you're having, your chief duty as an Israelite is still to fear and obey God. Because that's what it means to be an Israelite. Now, as Tom said, these are some inconvenient truths. I wrote it down this way. Kohelet's words are hard to swallow. But sometimes words to the wise are hard truths. They are hard to swallow. And as you read through Ecclesiastes, you cringe sometimes at what he's saying. Especially if you're thinking, how does this thing even in the Bible? And it almost didn't get in there. But it's God's will that it is in there. And so when you struggle with this book, it's having an effect on you. And I think it's supposed to have an effect on you because there are different ways of looking at wisdom. And I think this book, being in the Bible, as strange as it might seem, is telling us that we need to broaden our understanding of wisdom. There's a place for this book in the Bible. It's difficult sometimes to figure out what the place is. So that was kind of, the first part of our task was to take this book and kind of, give it a bit of an explanation. We're kind of going to go in a different direction now, which is to take this poem that talks about for everything there's a season, and just kind of play off of that and talk about our lives and look at seasons that we've had in our lives. And I had just a few words of direction, not very many, and I'll just read them to you, brethren, so you can kind of see where you can look at what the brethren had to build off of. I asked the brethren, how do you recognize that things are changing? How do you recognize that there is a new season in your life? And then once you do recognize it, what do you do about it? Also, are there times where we should hold on to a season that we're in? And are there times that we should let it go? And can holding on too long be detrimental? And can letting go too soon be detrimental? And how do you come to those conclusions? And then just lastly is our relationship with God static? Is it stationary and immovable, or does it go through seasons where it changes and where it grows in different directions? And so we're going to go into this area of the discussion now. We're going to try to talk about seasons in our lives in a way that we hope that would be a blessing to the brethren in some shape or form. That being said, we'll ask if either Tom or Rick would like to start us off.
Tom?
Well, everybody's looking at the screen, so I
Yes,
guess
we are.
I guess I will go first. First of all, it was a blessing to have those questions, Brother Jerry, and to go through an exercise of listing out seasons in my life and reflecting in a way I really hadn't. And I have this listing that kind of amazed me as I tried to put those down and where the shifts had occurred. So I want to thank you for that. As I read the poem and was thinking about the various spectrums that he describes there, since this year, Janice and I sold the home that we had lived in for 33 years and had moved it now into a condominium. I was definitely relating to the line that says a time to keep and a time to throw away. Because we're downsizing. And as we were going through this, I was remarking to Janice and recalling, I guess, especially times, the 9 years we lived in Omaha, Nebraska, and when our family expanded with our first adopted child, of how much we used to go out shopping and buying things and accumulating things in life. And now we go in and we don't do that kind of shopping anymore. We don't want to acquire anything. We are trying to dispose of things to simplify our life. And my, what a contrast that is. And so that's one shift that has taken place. I know we have a standing rule when we go on trips now. If we go into gift stores or whatever, we have a rule: we can't buy anything that hangs on a wall because we have no more wall space. Yeah, or Janice says, or a jigsaw puzzle, because we love jigsaw puzzles, but we have a bookcase full of them. But at any rate, let me just touch on some other seasons and shifts. I grew up in through my years in high school in a typical American family, a very religious family. But then when I was in college, I met Brother Larry McClellan, and I heard a new version of the gospel message. And that was, an amazing shift as that information appealed to my mind. And so, here I am among you today. That's one shift. It was a quantum leap. I think one other thing that you've heard me talk about my experiences in my earlier life, living with undiagnosed depression. I've talked about this before. It's not new information. And so I was thinking that in those years, I will share with you one of my favorite verses, and it was from Ecclesiastes, the 7th chapter. I took great comfort in this verse. It's verse 3. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by the sadness of the countenance, the heart is made better. You know, with the picture I had of myself and life around me in those times, this scripture was a great comfort to me. I thought, well, my heart is going to be made better because of my sad disposition and my terrible self-image. And yeah, verse 2 says it's better to go into the house of mourning than to go into the house of feasting. I wasn't very joyful. And so having that diagnosed and treated was a huge shift in my life. And I was trying to look at the poem and say, well, what spectrum does that relate to? And maybe it's in verse 3, a time to kill and a time to heal. It's been a time of healing for me, and my life has been amazing since that shift has occurred. So and of course that has changed my relationship with my dear wife and family, as well as my relationships all around me, and certainly with my Heavenly Father. And I think I'll stop at that point, because I can go on and talk about shifts in my relationship with God, but maybe it's Rick and your turn to wade in on this subject.
Yeah, thank you, Brother Tom. I think the way I kind of envision things was, we would just kind of play off each other and, do a little bit for each of us. But would you mind if I just probed a little bit? Because, I think the reason why we're doing this is to be a help to the brethren. So if we've gone through a season in our life that maybe some of the brethren are going through now or will go through in the future, is there something that they can learn from us that will help them? So you talked about depression. I'm just wondering, how long were you in it before you realized what it was, that was a season you were in, and how did you work your way to the point where you did, find help in getting out of it?
Well, again, I've been quite open about this in other presentations. I came to know God as I know Him now, at least as I know His plan at age 20. That's when I met Larry McClellan at Michigan State University and found this wonderful gospel message. And I was diagnosed with depression at age, I forget what year, I was either 42 or 43 years old. And so it's kind of amazing, to have this wonderful message which gladdened my heart at a certain level, but still my perspectives on myself. I will say that probably because of the depression that was unrecognized and undiagnosed, as I listed down different times in my relationship with God, one of my notes says, that there was this time when I was convinced shortly after I had come to know God's plan, that I was also convinced I was going into second death, that I'd made a consecration, but I just was making no progress, and I'm sure God would, not have anything more to do with me. I think that was a manifestation of the way I looked at the world because of that. And I will tell you, and again, I've been open about this, and I have my wife's permission. My depression was diagnosed because we were having problems in our relationship, and we were seeing a marriage counselor. And after about a year of counseling, the counselor we were seeing said, "Tom, could you stay after our session here?" He knew that we both came directly from work in separate cars, and Janice could leave and I could stay. And he gave me a simple little standard test of 21 questions that they use to diagnose depression, and I scored moderately high. And then he recommended that I start seeking separate counseling for that. And about 6 months later, we ended our marriage counseling because things had started to change. And I will tell you that one of the reactions was that I was, a little put out by that, because I felt that by being diagnosed with depression, now the focus was on me. Oh, Tom is the whole problem in the marriage. And I resented that for a while, but of course that wasn't true. And because of having that depression, I did resent and pushed away at criticism directed toward me. I could not take criticism because my self-image was so low. Criticism was very hard to deal with. And so in a relationship such as with a wife, when you receive criticism, and you do in a marriage, from one another at times, that would cause me to emotionally withdraw from her and the whole family. And now that's not an issue. So perhaps those comments are helpful. But it is amazing that for the first for the first 22 or 23 years of my consecrated life, I was living with undiagnosed depression. And that means that for the first 17 or 18 years of our marriage relationship, my dear wife lived with me with undiagnosed depression. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Brother Tom. I know these things can be difficult, but I think there's probably some brethren who I think will be helped greatly by your words and by your experience. Thank you, Brother Tom. Brother Rick?
Well, some of what Brother Tom said, I've not had those issues, but think about the seasons. All right, he was in a season of undiagnosed depression and didn't know what to do, and started reaching out. And when the time came, he was able to see it. And I think that's the important thing. He was able to respond to a change. Sometimes, though, for us, it's not that way. We're in a season of our lives, and maybe we want to change something, and we're like, okay, the message comes, but we don't necessarily respond to it, maybe at all or maybe a little. I want to use as an example of this, and I'll give a personal experience, Simon Peter. Simon Peter was called by Jesus 3 different times. It took about a year or so for Peter to actually drop everything, follow Jesus, and not turn around and go back. So that to me is encouraging, because there was the call, and the first verse, shortly after Jesus comes back from his 40 days of fasting and praying, in John 1, 40 to 42, it says, one of the two who heard John speak followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He found first his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah." And he brought him to Jesus. And Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which translated as Peter. He is telling Simon, you are going to be different because of me. Now, Simon didn't necessarily respond to that, but he was given an invitation to something higher. There was a new season essentially in front of him. that he listened to but didn't fully respond to. And that's human nature. That's absolutely human nature. So, Jerry, your question, one of your sub-questions, how do we recognize change in the season of our life? Has it started? Is it already changed? Sometimes it happens and we have to get knocked on the head a few times. Simon Peter was an example. I'm an example of that. And many of you, brethren, have heard this story before, but and I'll make it quick in the interest of time. But 25 years ago, when Christian Questions, before Christian Questions started, I first of all had no thought about doing anything like that at all, not even remotely close. But I was in a personal quandary, and I realized that the Lord had given me the capacity to communicate, and I didn't think I was using it like I should in His service. So I'm praying about it, saying, Lord, this is wonderful. What am I supposed to do with this? And dear Brother Jonathan Benson, because he had talked to Brother Peter Carabas, came around, 2 or 3 months after I started praying about this consistently, and he says, "Hey Rick, what do you think about the idea of doing a radio show and making it?" Oh, I'm sorry, I hear myself very loudly, so I'm afraid that I'm blaring. But anyway, sorry. So he said to me, we could do that, and I looked at him and I said, Jonathan, come on, we don't have any experience. It's ridiculous. And I basically walked away. Now here I am, the communicator, saying, no, I don't want to take an opportunity to go communicate with lots of people about the truth. I mean, what's wrong with that picture? It just didn't dawn on me. It didn't settle into my brain. Well, a few months later, Jonathan came back around and said, Rick, I'm telling you, this is a really good idea. And I said, Jonathan, who's got time to do that? And I walked away from it. Now, what does that tell you? Now, I go back to praying, Lord, please show me a way to use my communication ability in your service. And Jonathan is delivered twice, and I don't see it. It took a third time when Jonathan actually had the opportunity open up that I finally realized that this was the Lord trying to get through my preconceived idea of what I thought should or shouldn't be. So one of the issues in the changing of seasons in our lives, brethren, is our own preconception, our own expectation of what we might be looking for versus the way the Lord is going to answer it. For Simon Peter, his first calling was simply a name change. He didn't get it entirely. He got it a little, it stimulated his interest, and he hung around Jesus, but he went back to fishing. And so I think it's important, Brother Jerry and Brother Tom, to just, when we look at the things that change in our lives, realize that if you don't get it the first time, it's not a catastrophe, but it is a growing experience. And most of us aren't able to just say, oh, that's it, and go. The reason I said yes to Christian Questions was Jonathan called me and said, I'm at a radio station, I'm talking to the manager, and he says we can do this. Then I said, okay, let's talk about it. But that's what it took. For him, he had the idea in his head. For me, I was just shut because I wasn't personally open because I had different expectations. I'll stop there, brother.
Thank you, Brother Rick. I think because you're in a unique position, I think you're the only brother who has a radio show that I know of.
Podcast now.
I just want to ask one follow-up, and because this is what I was thinking about when I kind of came up with this idea, and I knew you were on the panel, is that as brethren, we have been doing things a certain way for a long time. We've got the volumes, we've got the reprints. Every once in a while we have a public witness. We would track door to door. And that's kind of what we did. So I'm just wondering, this is a big change of season, not only for yourself, but I think for the brethren, because we're doing something different. I'm wondering if you had any criticism for doing something different, or if you see anything in the future as a change of season, it's like it's time to change and do something even more different. Maybe just a little insight if you could share.
Criticism, yes, because the approach was very, very different than typical public witnesses. It was more of a conversation with the public. It wasn't something that you had to tell them everything right up front. You built a relationship and informed them over time. And I had no experience with this. And for me, and this gets very personal, brethren, but for me it was literally relying on the Lord each and every week, especially at that very, very beginning stage. And then, of course, things did change after that. So, yeah, it was obvious to us, to Brother Jonathan and myself and our families, and actually with our families, it was Brother Sean and Sister Rebecca Armstrong were involved in that initial conversation, as was Sister Ella Kelly. There were 7 of us sitting at Jonathan's house when Christian Questions was born. And those are the brethren that were all there. And it was obvious to us that this is the Lord saying, do this. The next changes happened several years later when Jacob from Indiana, Jacob Bialik, who is now one of our consultants and has come to many conventions, he's been to our house and all of that, called out of the blue or contacted us and said, we want to put you on our radio station. And he engineered many other changes. So now we're not just on one radio station, but we're on 3 or 4 different radio stations. And now we do podcasting. So it hasn't stayed the same. And I'm going to be very brief because this is a very long story. But every time something changed, it was costly. Every single time. It was costly. I never suffered from depression like dear Brother Tom has. And I really appreciate his journey. It's an amazing journey. But I would suffer from anxiety, physical anxiety. It used to be Sunday mornings. We'd do the radio program, and on Sunday night, I'd go up to my little study area, and I'd start to work on things, and I'd get short of breath, and I'd start to pant, and because I had to do it again. It had to happen again next week. And it was a really hard thing to grow into. But the lesson from all of that is that I have been learning is whatever level of responsibility or privilege we are given with time, rather than if the Lord is opening a door and you see that door and you say, yeah, this is the Lord, you walk through it. And even if you don't know how, you walk through it in faith, you reach out to get help, and the Lord supplies the need. So a change in season doesn't come gift wrapped with all the utensils and all the pieces. It comes with the skeletal look of, here's what it might look like. And stepping out in faith builds the rest of the parts. It's a tremendous journey. Change is hard, but it is one of the most worthwhile things we'll ever go through. I'll stop there.
Okay, well, thank you, Brother Rick. I was thinking for myself, what could I share? Like Brother Tom, I had jotted down some notes about, early consecration. I think, for everybody, it's a big change of season. I didn't want to start there though, because I think pretty much all of us kind of have been through that. I want to start somewhere where maybe others might be going through it or will go through it, in the near future, and that is dramatic change of life, including changing employment, picking up and moving, leaving your ecclesia, a big change like that. For myself, I had been working in a small engineering college. I'd been married, obviously not obviously, but we're married in 95, and this was getting close to maybe 97, 98, around those years. And it was a good job, and I was moving up through the ranks. I really enjoyed the work. But then we had a new boss come in. And not too much longer after the new boss came in, my job changed. And it wasn't really a bad change, but what had happened was um, the actual, the buildings with the professors and so forth were on one side of a very large street, like a 4 or 5 lane kind of a deal. Speed limit's pretty high. On the other side of the campus was like a 7 or 8 story apartment complex, which was student housing. And there was one individual who basically his job was maintaining the apartment building. Well, he left for a new job, so they were a man short. So they asked me to cover for him until they could get somebody else. So I had a job on both sides of the street now. So I was stretched pretty thin, which is fine. That's not a big deal. But the problem came in where this was an engineering college. They would get vehicles, and they would try to engineer them to do certain things a certain way, and they were not licensed once they got them. They would do experimental things on them. They could not be driven on the roads. They could be driven on the campus, though. And that was my work vehicle, which was fine when I was on one side of the street. And I had been doing that for quite some time. When I was required not to go to the other side of the street, I got nervous about it because it's like this isn't right that I should be doing this. If I should get in an accident, and if I should hurt somebody, I mean, I'm liable for this because I know I'm breaking the law. I know this is an unlicensed vehicle. And so for many weeks went through a process between my union rep and this new boss about, I don't feel comfortable doing this. And through that process, what he basically ended up telling me to do was, well, then just park the vehicle on this side of the campus, pick up your tools, and walk across the street, which I did. And it wasn't something that worked out very well. And so the change of season is, for me, was something, I don't know where this thought came from. Julie and I were driving down the street. Actually, we were going to a Sunday meeting. And I said, what do you think about moving to Connecticut? I don't know where the thought came from. It wasn't premeditated. It just came to me that it is time to make a change. This job is coming to an end because of the situation. And I saw a need, for the move out here to the East Coast. And when we discussed it amongst ourselves and family members, and then we did it. We just took the plunge and we made the change. And so you can have a major change of season, and it can come to you so fast, and it can be so life-changing. That's how that particular change was for me. I don't really know what the lesson might be for anyone else, other than the fact that don't think that where you're at now is where you're going to be a month from now, because things can change, and your seasons can certainly change. Brethren, there's no particular order here. Brother Tom, Brother Rick, care to share anything at all on your list?
Well, Brother Jerry, let me just go back to Simon Peter. His second drawing by Jesus is in Matthew 4:18-22. I'm just going to read verse 19. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And the next verse says, Immediately they, Simon and Andrew, immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on from there, he saw two others and so forth. So Peter, the second time, he hears Jesus and he drops everything and he walks away to follow Jesus. But he doesn't stay with him. So he committed himself to following, but not quite fully yet. And my point with this is sometimes the changes in our lives, like in your experience, it took you weeks to work through this. You knew in your mind what was right. You had to work through it to get there and then finally make the decision. Finally, Simon Peter in Luke 4, 5 through 11, Luke 5, I'm sorry, verses 4 through 11. Oops. Here's the last interchange. When Jesus had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Because remember, Simon had gone back to fishing, and now he's back with Jesus. Simon answered, "Master, we've worked all night, but we've caught nothing." Okay, he was fishing. "Yet if you say so, I'll let down my nets." And when they had done this, they caught so many fish, their nets were beginning to break. In verse 8 it says, when Simon Peter saw this, now keep in mind, he had been drawn by Jesus twice before. When he saw this, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I'm a sinful man." Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men. You will be catching people." And when they brought their boats ashore, they left everything and followed him. We need to learn to step up to the changes that are coming. And sometimes it takes a process. And by God's grace, he knows that we can be stubborn or not paying attention or just not ready. But he can work us into it. And when Simon Peter drops to his knees before Jesus and says, "Go away from me, I'm a sinful man," what that's saying to me, what I understand that to mean is he's saying, "Lord, I know you know who I am, and I don't see how I can do what you're asking me to." And Jesus said, "Don't worry, I will make you fishers of men." And that's what brought Simon Peter to follow him. So the changes of life sometimes take growing into, if you will.
Very good. Thank you, Brother Rick. Let's go to Brother Tom to see if he would like to share anything else.
Well, work in our lives often is a brings about change. But let me start by saying that for me, sometimes these shifts in seasons are only recognized after we're in them for a while and we're looking backward and we see the shift. Other times, because they involve outward circumstances, they are recognized immediately. I was when Janice and I found ourselves moving from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and the Jackson, Michigan ecclesia in 1981 out to Omaha, Nebraska. It was a completely unexpected change. It caught us by surprise. No one could have predicted it, but it was obvious. And let me just share a little story about that. When that suddenly came upon us, Brother Edgar Buckley, we were telling this at the Sunday meeting. Brother Edgar Buckley said, "Did you read the manna this morning?" And I said, "No, I don't think so." He says, "Well, you need to read it." And we said, "Well, we will." And he says, "No, right now." And he made us look it up and read it. And I was just looking for it, and I can't find which day it was, but it says, when change and unsettling circumstances come upon us, we just need to follow the Lord's direction. And so that was comforting, the message of that manna comment. But understanding how clear it was that it was the Lord's will became clear a little while after that. Sister Jan called her mother, Sister Evelyn McAllister, and told her that we're moving to Omaha, Nebraska. Tom's job is moving out there. If he doesn't move, he loses his job. And her mother said, "Oh, Paul and Joyce were thinking of moving out to Omaha, Nebraska." Well, we didn't know that. And of course, Jan and Joyce are stepsisters, and so we called them up, and uh, Jan reached Joyce, and Joyce says, "Well, we decided not to do that because there's like no brethren out there and whatever, and so we're looking for a house here in the Columbus, Ohio area, and we have an appointment this afternoon to go look at a house." And she says, "But I think I need to talk to Paul, and we'll get back to you." And she called back a little while, and she said, "We talked. We've canceled the house hunting appointment. We're going to move to Omaha, Nebraska." And I'll tell you, what those years in Omaha, and then joining together with Roz and Marguerite Roswick for those years are so important in our life. But it was so clear that it was the Lord's will, and that was such a comfort in our lives. But after 9 years, my job moved me to Madison, Wisconsin, where we live now. And as I worked, one of the things I never wanted to be. I was in a senior staff position, considered the expert in the program area in which I was working, and I was happy. I never wanted to be a manager or supervisor of people. I never wanted to do that. And when I moved to the move to Madison here required me to become a supervisor and a manager of people. Talk about great anxiety and discomfort. But I survived it. I can look back now and understand the Lord's purpose and the value of the lessons that I have gained from going through that, learning to deal with conflicts, learning how to be a mediator and a reconciler through the work that I found myself in. I wouldn't trade those experiences for anything. And I just, I just await to see how the Lord is going to use those skills that He taught me through those experiences, and how they will somehow be useful someday. Well, not someday. Hopefully they're useful right now, as well as in a grander way in the future. So some things are obvious, and some we only see by looking backward. I will tell you just one other, moving into more of the relationship with God. I was at a training conference for supervisors, and the instructor just tossed out a question: who can define grace for me? And that was kind of an out of context question in a supervisory training course, and my mind went blank. I couldn't raise my hand and think of how to define grace. But one of my colleagues did, and my inability to come up with an answer on the spot embarrassed me, and I thought I should look into this subject. And I began looking into the subject of grace, the grace of God. And that has been a huge shift in my understanding of God and how He deals with me and other individuals, and how He intends to deal with mankind. And I was led by some recommendations to read a couple of different books on the subject that probably have been the most meaningful and impactful books I have read other than the writings of Brother Russell and the Bible itself. And that has shifted who I am as a person and the way that I look at God and the world around me. And it's been a huge shift. And one of those books talked about the two dimensions of grace. I've used that in a discourse, talking about the vertical dimension of the grace we receive from God, but then the grace that we are to spread to one another as the horizontal dimension of grace. And I really like a verse in the first chapter of John. The King James and most other translations just talk about grace upon grace. But I really love the Phillips translation of verse 16. It says, "Indeed, every one of us has shared in his riches. There is a grace in our lives because of his grace." And that is what I have tried to live, that my life would reflect grace in my dealings with one another because of the grace he has shown to me. And that is one of the things I try to live by. That was one of the major shifts in my relationship with my Heavenly Father and the Lord Jesus. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Brother Tom. A lot of good points. In your comment, how do we recognize when we're in a change of season? How do we determine if this is really God's will? Is He really leading me this way? And I'll just say, one thing is things worked out in your move splendidly. Things worked out in my move miraculously, positively. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if things go wrong, it's not God's will. Because, your life going great is not necessarily an indication that it's God's will that your life goes great. So just continue what you're doing because you're doing great things and God thinks it's good. Your life could be going terrible, but that could be God's will for your life. And I'll just relate a little bit of an experience, a change of season that I had along this line, and that was, I grew up Catholic. I went to Catholic church until I was 18, and the first opportunity I had to stop going, which is when my parents couldn't see me, I stopped because I never made it, personal. So I went to college and I just stopped going to church, became somewhat of a, I wouldn't say an atheist, but kind of an agnostic, like, prove it to me kind of a thing. And then as a young man, I ended up moving out to California, thinking I would pursue my dreams of trying to be a baseball player. And it came to a point where I was living in a boarding house, renting a room from an elderly woman. Basically got down to no money, spent all my money. Had a job. I was a line cook at a roast beef restaurant, standing there on the line, dishing out the food. I had a big chef hat thing. And it was Thanksgiving. And I was on a break, and I was sitting in a booth by myself, and I was so lonely. I just sat there and I cried. And I said, what am I doing with my life? I've got this family that I love, who love me. They're all in Michigan. Here I am in California. I got nobody. I got no prospects. I'm doing something I don't want to do. And it was that experience that started me to thinking that there must be, is this all there is to life? There has to be more. And it started me down the road to question God. And to question God in an internal dialogue to saying, is there something more to life than seeking my own will? Because seeking my own will has led me absolutely nowhere, with no prospects. And that was the beginning of a change of season for me. It took me several years going to several different church denominations before finally coming in contact with the truth. As Brother Tom said, you look back and you can say, this was a change of season. I didn't realize it at the time, but I do now. Brother Rick.
Sounds like you had a Solomon moment there, huh? Like, what is this all worth for? What's the value? Just in terms of just changing of seasons, and sometimes, brethren, we can run ahead of the Lord, and we got to be careful of that. And I've done that, and sadly, I'm going to tell you about it. Many years ago, I worked in a cabinet and countertop shop, and I was doing okay, supporting the family, and I took an interest in a financial services business, and I started doing that part-time. And I saw the financial services business as an opportunity to be able to control my time, which it was and is. And I really worked hard at developing it so I could make a career change. Well, I made the career change, brethren, but I made it too soon. I was not ready. I thought I was, but ask my wife, I wasn't. And it was a hardship. It was a hardship for our family for several years. And I had to come to grips with, okay, I've walked away from that, and here I am here. Now, why did I make the change? Because it really was an absolute core desire of mine to be able to control my time so I could use time in direct service to the Lord. And that was my prayer. And at the beginning, there was no time for anything of any kind, because all I got to do was work really hard at something that was sputtering, and then I had to do a little part-time cabinet making because we didn't have enough to make ends meet. So there were several years of that. I pushed a change before it was appropriate. Now, by God's grace, by His grace, things leveled out. And once they began to level out is when the Christian Questions opportunity came along. And wouldn't you know, what that needed was a lot of flexible time. So it was 6 or 7 years from the time I made the career change till the time the Lord said, okay, that was in your heart, that was good. Now that you've suffered and struggled and made all of those mistakes and had to grovel through them, now I can give you that opportunity that you said you wanted. Let me see how you do with that. And so seasons come and go, and life changes, and maybe sometimes, brethren, we run ahead a little bit. It doesn't mean it's over. It just means you have to work through it. And when you look at any scriptural example of Christian growth, what you always see is a process. And change is not a moment. It is the slow turning of a page and the phasing out of one thing and the phasing in of something else. Now, obviously, when you change a job, you go directly from one to the other. But for instance, when you do that, you have to phase out of the mentality that you were in and into the mentality that you are embracing. So change is not simple. And our lives do require us to step up to different levels and different seasons. And for me, that was a very significant experience that I look back on a lot, with very, very grateful heart to say, thank you, Lord, for keeping us afloat during those very, very difficult times. And also, for me, and again, this is very personal, giving me one of the desires of my heart, which was to try to serve the Lord with whatever he's given me to do. So just very quickly, a scripture, and we all know the scripture, Philippians 3:13, brethren, I do not regard myself as having laid hold of it yet, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and reaching forward to what lies ahead, I press toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. This applies to every change. It is a process. And wherever you are, never stop pressing toward attaining and achieving. Do one thing, leave others behind.
We're running very short on time. I'm going to ask Brother Tom if you've got any final words of wisdom for us.
No, I think we're short on time, and I've probably talked enough. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Brother Tom. All right. Well, thank you, brethren, for your attention. Perhaps as you have fellowship during your lunch period, you could discuss some of the seasons in your lives.